So we could start by talking about a little bit about your background. So you're both an academic and a social worker.
Yeah. I've been in social work now for about 30 years, one way or another. And for the last 13 years, I've been teaching in universities.
So you were a social worker, this was in Sheffield?
Yeah, mainly. I've worked in some other places as well, but mainly in Sheffield.
Right, so the thing I want to ask is, when I think of the word social worker, it seems like a sort of a multifaceted job, right? So I'm going to try and ask the Socratic question, right? If you're a social worker, you do like child protection, mental health work, drug rehabilitation, so family reunification, education, work with disabilities. Yeah. So all those disparate things, what do you think is the common denominator that makes a social worker a social worker?
Well, I think the key word is social. So it's about what, for me, social work is different to other professions. And what we're trying to do is understand that whole person, but in the context of their environments, so in the context of their communities, their families, within society. And what we try to do is kind of work at that interface between the individual and society.
So like by society, you mean like institutions like the police, the NHS, health, education?
Yeah, and less formal things. So like support networks, friendship networks, community groups, things like that.
So that describes the social part of it. What's the work you do? What is it?
Well, the work then gets divided up between the different professions, different specialisms. So child protection, very clearly, is focusing on keeping children safe. Usually keeping children safe within their families or making decisions that they can't live with their families and finding other places for them to live. So that's basically child protection. What child protection should be, because it really ought to be child and family social work. And child protection is an element of that, because really what we should be doing is supporting families, keeping children within their own families wherever possible. The law tells us that's what we're supposed to do. Section 17 of the Children Act. A child is best brought up by their birth family whenever possible. So that kind of notion, that stereotypical picture of the social worker as the child snatcher from
the government comes on and takes away it breaks up a family.
Yeah.
But I imagine that's not a decision any social worker would make lightly.
Not at all. It's the last thing. It really is the last thing to do. And there's a kind of like in the UK, the government really takes that position of like it's not the state's job to intervene in family life, which is very different to Scandinavia, where they're much more likely to get involved in a family's life because they see it as part of their role. They kind of think, children should be supported by the state. Here we do that kind of like, an Englishman's home is his castle, so we keep out. But when we go in, it tends to be we go in quite heavily.
It's a really difficult one to negotiate that, because I can understand the Scandinavian impulse there, because it's on some minimal level the government's role should be to protect children.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I would be if it was me. Sure, It's just like, the state should take its responsibility seriously. Yeah. It's like if you're going to support families, then get in there and support them. Don't leave it. And, we also kind of think of like, we talk about parental responsibility in this country rather than parental rights or things. So we sort of say it's your job, parent, to look after your children and keep your children safe. It's not the state's job, but we will do it if we need to.
Right. So then, in terms of being again, what is the social worker? Is it someone who works for the government then, or is it someone? Is there like? I mean, is there a difference, say, with a community worker or a charity worker? Yeah,
well, social work as a profession, because it's got those statutory roles, so in child protection and mental health mainly, but also in, discharging older people from hospital, making sure that they're sort of integrated back into the community. It's got those statutory roles that, governed by statute. But lots of social workers end up working in the private voluntary sector as well. So NSPCC, Barnardo's, Action for Children, Mind, lots of voluntary groups employ social workers.
Right, so there's neither necessarily of the government or of the private sector.
No.
And in many instances, it's straddling probably both roles.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that social work, as I kind of like traditionally understand it, is more commonly done in community groups, in community settings.
Yeah, so that brings me on to the other sort of philosophical question then, is that as someone who has sort of worked on the theoretical side and on the practical side, which gives you sort of a unique perspective, do you find that across the range of your profession that there's kind of sort of common values that are held together? Again, I'm asking the Socratic question: is there sort of a set of values that bind social workers together? I'm sure there's internal dissent and disagreements and all of that, but is there an overarching?
Yeah, we keep trying to hold one together. There's the professional organisations like the British Association of Social Workers have a code of ethics. We talk about professional values all the way through. So the old College of Social Work had a set of values attached to it. But the problem with social work is that it's a very fluid profession. It moves in and out of different realms of significance, I think, really. And at the moment, we seem to have a very sort of like government-led, this is what we want you to do, this is what it will be, this is what social work looks like. And I think as social workers, we're kind of losing that sense of what are our common values. So when we've got values like, to act in an anti-oppressive way,
an anti-oppressive
way. We talk about anti-oppressive practices a lot. The values are, we keep writing and rewriting, is what I'm trying to say. Is we are, and trying to make sense of them. And very often when we think about ethics, I actually read a really good paper recently where it talks about we're in a sort of sense of ethical moral distress sometimes because what we're doing and our ethical stance are disparate. So we don't often feel that we're working in the way that we want to work. That the job goes against the value base.
Right. Okay. Well, this is basically all jobs probably at some level. Yeah. I wonder. I mean, is it the case then that you have different administrations? So you say how long were you a social worker for? You said 12, 13 years.
Well, no. About 30 years in social.
Oh, sorry, you say as a social worker.
13 years in
academia of social work, yeah. But in that time, then you've seen various government administrations come in and out. You've been under Conservatives, you've been under sort of Labour governments, you've been under coalition governments. Is it the case then that like whatever government is in place, they then try to impose their values upon what one ought to do with how social work is deployed in society?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Children Act 1989 was a Thatcher government sort of piece of legislation. I mean, generally as a piece of legislation, it's quite good, but it shifted that thing from parental rights into parental responsibility. It was like a shoving back. So as the state sort of pushing back to parents, it's like it's not the state's job to look after your children; it's your job. Prior to that, I think it was more usual for children to come into care at the request of their parents, and it sort of like really shifted then to sort of like, no, we'll decide if we bring your children into care rather than you. It's your job to look after your children. When we moved into the Blair government, what they came along with was the Every Child Matters agenda, which was very much like, we need to, and really seeing children as capital, economic capital. This is the future workforce. So we have to look after all children. We have to keep children safe, but
insofar as they're productive.
They're productive. They're going to be an investment into the future. But what the Blair governments did was actually invest a lot of money and set up things like Sure Start and things which were really, really important, really, really powerful. And then we got the coalition government that just withdrew from all of that stuff.
Right.
And so...
so an austerity economic agenda, basically, yeah.
So we're really blowing the wind of government policy.
Yeah. Well, like all institutions, I guess, education is no different. So now the question is, in the current administration, what does social work look like in sort of Brexit Britain, post-Brexit Britain, pre-Brexit Britain? Who knows? Yeah.
Para-Brexit.
Para-Brexit.
Yeah. I don't know. It feels like I always, a few times write about social workers being in that sort of like, on that paradigmatic shift thing. We're in that sort of state of essential tension where we realise that what we're doing now is not working. We're not quite sure what we're moving into. We don't, we've been in this kind of risk paradigm for the last 20 years where everything's about risk. It's like measuring risk, managing risk, evaluating risk, and that's really driven practice for a long time. I think we're moving into something else, but I can't quite see what that is yet. But I think what we're all realising is that this risk thing's not functioning.
So by risk, you're talking about the quantitative measurement of risk.
Well,
is that possible even?
It's not possible. To quantitative measures of risk, the actuarial risk management is just impossible. So we're talking about messy, complex lives. You can't, do a kind of, what insurance companies do is they sort of like, they can sort of put in gender and age and all that stuff and calculate how likely you are to have an accident. It's really not that easy when we're talking about dynamic lives
so like families and particular societies within class, within sort of in regard to institutions.
When all the economic ground is shifted, and that's I think really what we're noticing more and more these days is that more and more people are living in poverty. That austerity's really hit hard at the most vulnerable people in society. And so we see more and more people falling into our remit that wouldn't have sort of 5-10 years ago. So we're seeing increases in number of children in care because there are more people living in poverty. What that looks like, how we become Brexit Britain, I don't know. But if austerity continues and the state is again withdrawing from its citizens and not actually enabling them to manage effectively in society, we will end up with more and more need for social work services. And
so again, that risk model is interesting then, which seems to be driven by a lot of both of the different administrations. So I mean, when I look at when I was sort of looking into stuff for preparation for this, it seemed that sort of the word neoliberal was used a lot, and it's a word that's turned up in this podcast a lot. But a lot of sort of the literature about saying what social work is says that it's currently under a type of neoliberal sort of economic model. Now, what I take that to mean in the context of social work is that it's the retreat of the state, the retreat of the government, retreat of sort of a public sphere, and the imposition of sort of the idea of sort of market-oriented forces.
Yeah.
And is that sort of amplifying this notion of risk? Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. And it's that kind of like, we're probably living globally within that risk society. We're sort of like that late modernity that Beck talks about. We've moved into this thing that everything's about risk.
So Ulrich Beck, yeah?
Yeah. And what that's kind of like arguing really is that there's this need for experts who are there to manage the uncertainties and make everyone feel safe. And so social work is given that role for the most vulnerable people in society. So child protection is about, we'll need some experts that we can hold to account if these people get hurt. And so social work is there as this kind of expert that manages society's guilt, really.
And this is something that's manifested within the individual social worker. There's someone who's at a very, very practical, going to people's houses, going into sort of I can use the word troubled families or troubled homes, But at the same time, they have the sort of the technocratic side where they have to put it in sort of in actuarial terms, as you put it. You know, have to sort of fill out the forms and have to sort of calculate how every single case. Yeah.
I'm having to account for everything. It's a kind of like a sort of system of recording, really, and it becomes auditing. Yeah. So what we have is everyone is auditing social work files. So there are tiers and tiers of people reading what social workers write, and social workers spend more and more time sat at their desks making sure they get the recording right, and they're not actually out there with families helping them to
doing social work.
Yeah, doing social work, helping them through change.
Could you give me an example of how that might? Could you give me an example of a particular case? If is that permissible? That actually, can you?
Yeah. I can't tell you about a particular case that I've worked on or sort of make anything things. The famous ones are the big ones. So the ones that create the moral panics, the ones that hit the headlines. So people like Victoria Clambier and Peter Connolly. Peter Connolly, the social workers who worked on that case.
This is Baby P.
Baby P, yeah. They did very little wrong in their recording, in their process. So lots of procedure was followed, but still, we end up with
they missed out the obvious,
missing out those questions. We often get to it. There was a serious case review in Sheffield, which around the W family. Okay, so what happened there was professionals were getting into the house, but they were only going into the downstairs. So they were just in the living room, and it was fine. It was not a problem. What we ended up with there was some of the children were actually ended up being admitted to hospital because they were severely neglected, and they found out subsequently that upstairs it was a completely different. It was where the children actually was appalling. It was really, really awful. But the response to that was, okay, so from now on, every social worker has to go into every child's bedroom. And there's a box on the form that every social worker has to tick. And you can sort of see that there's a response that these children's bedrooms weren't seen, they were awful. Therefore, it's good sense to make sure that we check children's bedrooms. But what if the issue's not actually in the child's bedroom? It's in the shed at the bottom of the garden, or it's somewhere else. Do we just add more and more boxes, or do we actually say to social workers, you actually need to use your senses, yourself, your common sense, your instincts to look out what you need to look out for to make sure that these children are safe?
That's difficult, and that becomes quite invasive, I would imagine. Or there's possibilities there for the perception of it to become invasive. What's he looking into my room for? Yeah.
Well, I think the invasiveness is there. So, as social workers, we are walking into people's homes as the state and saying the state is concerned about your parenting. We're going to check it out, and we'll do things like open cupboards and see if there's food in there. We'll check beds, see if the sheets are wet or dry. We'll do things like that. My issue with it is that if there's a box on there, we do it in a tokenistic way, and we do it every time we go around. Now, I would rather that social workers knew when to do it and knew when not to do it, and actually to focus on something else. If the family have got a different issue that week, that you actually spend time doing that and focusing on that and listening to people and engaging with people, not ignoring those checks that need to be done, but knowing when to do them and how to do them sensitively. As soon as it becomes a box on the form,
it becomes abstract.
People stop it doesn't mean anything. Have you done it? Yes, I've done it. Not rather than, are these children safe?
Which should be the priority, I presume. Yeah.
It becomes technocratic. It becomes a sort of like rational exercise rather than an instinctive caring act.
So you think that in some sense that because of the broader political pressures on social workers, in some sense they've become more sort of policemen than nurses, maybe.
Yep. And that's
because it is a type of policing, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It oughtn't to be, but that's what it's become. There was another case in Sheffield, a baby who died while he was being prop fed. Now, it's a really dangerous thing to do for babies. But the response to and social workers have been out and done an assessment before that, and I honestly can't see that there would be any way that they knew that child was being prop fed unless they actually saw it. So unless you're in there 24 hours a day, you're not going to pick up things like that. So I don't think the social workers were at blame, but the manager's response to it was nobody went outside of procedures. And they're kind of like, so we're all right because we didn't go outside of procedures. We followed our procedures. It was just like...
Is there an anxiety there about being sued? Or?
Yeah. Well, it's an anxiety about being blamed. So it's, and we've got into that really defensive way of working, which is just like, all I need to do in order to manage my professional anxiety is to make sure I stick within the procedures and believe that the procedures are safe.
So that means it turns the social worker into someone who's managing their professional anxiety, so it turns them inwards rather than outwards.
Yeah. And I think what we end up doing is looking at risk in terms of the professional risk to ourselves rather than the experience of the child. Children don't experience risk. Children experience harm or fear. They have a whole set of things that they experience. None of them are risk.
It's very immediate for children, isn't it?
Yeah. None of them are risk. We experience risk. Because what we're doing is trying to calculate the likelihood of a particular child being harmed by a particular set of circumstances. So all the risk thinking is about us. So I think what we're doing is we're sort of like drawing it into ourselves. And then we become concerned with, well, if I get this wrong, what will it be like for me? Rather than what's happening for that child.
Yeah. So it's an inward sort of regime or an inward practice.
Yeah.
Can I ask, like, from your long experience, and from sort of your sort of pedagogical work and your research work, is there kind of a can you imagine situations where social workers are working in opposition to that particular manager who's trying to manage the procedures? Is there a sort of resistance within the profession, and how does that manifest itself?
There's a constant resistance to it. And unfortunately, I think we've got less well organised as a profession. I think so there's, in the academic kind of world, there's lots and lots of resistance constantly. Always people writing about the problems of current practice contexts and things like that. It's certainly the individual workers, though, when they're living in that kind of performance management regime, where whether they get their next promotion or whether they become disciplined is based on how many boxes they've ticked or whether they got the right forms in the right places at the right time, because they're the things that are measurable. We always in that kind of neoliberal technical rationalisation thing is just like, these are the things we can measure, so that's what we measure. So we don't measure, actually, whether children are happier, healthier, feel safer, are more cared about, more loved, because then we can't measure those things. All we can measure is how often the social worker visited and if they ticked all the right boxes.
You talk about like an actual social worker and an actual, dealing with a particular client. Could you sort of envisage a situation where a social worker might, bend the rules?
Yep.
Or be... let's follow the prescriptions that are coming from policy and so on.
Yeah, and I'm sure social workers do that every day. Because they, if they care enough, they probably have to, in order to sort of get to the point where. But the cost to them is what they're doing is they are taking professional risks. If you go outside of procedures and something goes wrong, you're the one on the line. If you go out procedures and things go right, no one notices.
So you don't get any...
no one's going to see that.
You're going to raise, yeah?
No one's going to see that. If you go out procedures and something goes wrong, you're very, very much to blame. And that's why we're getting really high burnout rates in social work.
Is that true, yeah?
Yeah. So the average career for a child protection social worker is 8 years. For nurses, it's 16. For doctors, it's 25.
That's interesting. That means that the sort of the discourse on risk is not actually about the actual risk that social workers face, right? It's about that's about managing risk, about controlling risk, about sort of negating the possibility of risk.
Yeah.
Whereas if social workers are putting themselves in harmful situations and putting themselves in the way of hazard, if they're experiencing mental health problems such as burnout and fatigue, then why is that? Because they're working too hard? Because the situations are too challenging? They're
working too hard in the situation. They're making really, really complex judgments about people's lives. The decision to sort of walk into someone's house and say, you're not safe to look after your children, we're going to take that child away.
It's a horrible thing to do to someone, that, isn't it?
It's really a horrible thing to do. Really a horrible thing to do. And so knowing, that you've got the evidence for that, and it's not just a one-off decision. You've got to run that through various decision-making stages, and then ultimately take it up to the court, where you may have to be on the stand for a couple of days, being cross-examined by a range of barristers to convince a judge that that's the right option and no other options are possible. And all the time believing and hoping that you've made the right decision and that that's the right decision for that child and for that family. And all that time you are facing hostility very often from the family themselves, quite rightly. I'd be hostile if somebody took my children away. And very often a kind of like blame culture within other professionals. So you might have a multi-disciplinary team as part of making the decision, you'll often get people who say, well, I think you should have given them another chance, or I think you should have taken them away earlier, why have you left them so long? So, and social workers are always in that kind of like, we're the ones ultimately left with this decision. And that's caused a lot of anxiety. It's a distressful decision to make. So the trying to manage that kind of risk for yourself, risk for the family, risk for the child, are all really complex things.
So what tools then does the social worker use? I mean, trying to sort of empathise and put myself into that situation, because it could go well, obviously, or well, it's not going to go well, but it could be, if you know what I mean, it could go smoothly, shall we say, whereas a social worker experiences less anxiety, but then it could go very badly, where there could be the possibility of physical assault or verbal assault or abuse and so on towards the social worker. So what kind of tools does the social worker need, you think, in contradistinction to the more sort of risk model that you're sort of criticising? What kind of tools could they use going into that situation? I mean, how would you challenge your own biases going into that situation,
Yeah. Well, we do talk a lot about reflective practice and also reflexive practice. So like understanding, because you walk to someone's home and you're not seeing the situation as it is, you're seeing that situation as they are projecting it to you. Because they know who you are. You're a social worker. They're going to give you a different face.
Double bluff, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's a theatricality to it,
and Goffman's really useful in terms of looking at some of that stuff.
This is Irving Goffman.
Irving Goffman, yeah. So that's really interesting stuff. And you have, as a social worker, to be able to recognise that dynamic and to a certain extent break it down and engage with them. My concern constantly is because we've moved to this kind of thing of if we have a set of tools, as in, interview schedules or questionnaires, or we ask these questions in this order and we come up with these judgments, that anything like that is going to lead us to the right answer. And I don't think it does. There's a range of ways of working, some of them which are really quite ethical, sort of strengths-based work, where we're focusing on what people do well before we start focusing on what they do badly. They're all really good ways of starting to engage with families. But sometimes there's this belief that if you do those forms properly, if you do those techniques properly, you'll get the right answer. And it doesn't. It never is going to. It will lead you towards an answer. But there's something about you at the end of that that's got to make that judgment. and you're doing that all the way along, because even if you are sitting down with a family and sort of saying, going through a set of questions, you're filtering that. You're choosing what you hear, you're choosing what you're going to record, you're choosing how you record it, you're choosing the emphasis that you put on things. So I think social workers are very, very much involved in that. And actually kind of Merleau-Ponty's idea about the body sort of extends across the tool it's using, really, is something I really want to look into a bit more.
Yeah, we'll talk about that actually, because that's the thing that's sort of how we know each other. You're interested in using the philosophy of phenomenology to help look at social work, and we will talk about that. I have another question to ask you. I mean, can you sort of, from your experience, did you just like that sort of lived experience of of going into somebody's house, doing your job? Do you ever get it wrong, do you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, I think wrong is a
strong word.
And I think right is a strong word as well. I think we make a decision based on, the balance of probabilities within a context, within a time frame, within a set of things that we know.
So that could be sort of case history, mental health history, educational history, sort of prison history, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and if you take that whole sort of catalogue of sort of socio-economic factors, psychological makeup, history, personality, of all the different actors in any situation, and then things like parents going through mental health issues, which might be fluctuating. So the time that you're talking to them, they might be quite well, but further down the line, they might not be. If there's misusing substances, if there's domestic violence, if there are external factors, so they're living in a neighbourhood where that's not conducive to them being safe, so they're feeling a constant external threat. They lose their job. These are all dynamic factors. Very often what we do in social work is we go out and do an assessment, and we try to fix them in time. And all we're doing really is sort of taking a snapshot of what we think that family situation looked like at that particular time. Could be completely different a month later. So, the idea that we can use that snapshot to predict what's going to happen in 1 month, 2 months, 5 years' time is just kind of problematic, I kind of think.
So it sounds like a lot of social workers are just doing their best with what they got,
They are.
I mean, in terms of it's kind of research in action, since you're building up a picture of a particular social context.
It's exactly that. It's reflexive, qualitative social work. Qualitative research is what it is. You are trying to make sense of what you are seeing at the same time, and then adjusting how you're going to respond to that in the future. And I think on the whole, in the UK, we get it right. We make some really good decisions for people. And I'm not someone who wants to slag off social work as a sort of saying we've got everything wrong. I don't think the way we're currently thinking about social work is helpful. I think we can maybe do it better. But I think generally we do a good job. Okay,
so in terms then of doing it better, like what are your sort of thoughts or your recommendations on how that might happen?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to, in my work, what I'm trying to sort of argue is that we keep doing this kind of like trying to sum up people and their lives as if they're a set of factors that we can know in an objective sense. So, if we kind of know someone's psychological makeup, we can predict how they're going to respond to life in the future. If we know someone's socio-economic background, we know what the societal factors are within that neighbourhood, within that family. We can perhaps look at how that family works as a system. But we kind of like, if we believe that all of those things are knowable factors, and we can sort of like top them all up and then make a calculation about what is going to happen in the future, I think I don't think we can do that. And I also think those kind of like limited ways of thinking about what people are robs them of agency, and that these are people who actually have meaning. And again, what we do as social workers very often is like we look at someone and try to pin meanings onto them as a kind of like, well, I know from your history you're likely to be like this. I know from...
Is that a bias?
Yeah, very much a bias. And if you get people working within certain frames, so people like coming from a particular, like, I'm going to use psychodynamic theory to understand your situation, you're immediately limiting and fixing and restricting people's freedom. I think one of the things that I noticed as a practitioner was that whatever meaning I made of it, they had their own meanings. And if I could work with those, they're probably more likely to engage with me, but also probably more likely to try to resolve those things for themselves.
Right. So when you say agency, what you mean by that is the capacity of the client to self-actualize.
Yeah, make their own decisions, and understand their situation. And I think sometimes what we do is we see people as broken, and it's our job to fix them, or we see them as part of a broken family that it's our job to fix.
Yeah,
or
I used the word troubled earlier on, which is a very sort of a categorical term. Like it's not entirely right.
Well, and the government did that whole thing about troubled families.
Yes, that's what I was referring to. That was going on. Yeah.
And it was trying to pretend that I think it quite clearly said there's a set number of troubled families, and if we can get those right and fix those, the rest of society is all going to fall into place. And of course it's nonsense, because as soon as you help those people to change, there's going to be another set of people coming along, because we're moving the boundaries. So this idea that we try to see people as having a set of factors that we can know, and then we can predict or we can help them change in meaningful ways, a bit problematic. And so I want us to move towards a way of thinking about, I need to engage with a family. I'm a person who cares about what's happening to them. They're a person who obviously cares about what's happening to themselves. And we must be a sort of like joint enterprise between us about helping someone through a process of change, or to understand anxiety, and helping them get through that.
And so, because I suppose the advantage of that, and I am going to come to the sort of the phenomenology stuff, is because the advantage of that is that you start seeing people less in a less snobby type way, I might think. These are your clients are people with same as everybody, dreams, hopes, aspirations, and a search for meaning and a quest for meaning. You know, and at this point they do not have that. So it's a case about sort of, I don't know, restoring that in some way.
Yeah, or helping them to work out what that is. If you are really focused on I've got to find where the money's coming from for the next for the meals for the next week, and I've got to negotiate my way with the universal credit
on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is far away.
You've got a long way to go before you can start thinking, what's the meaning of life and what's the point of all this? But actually, I'm sure people are still trying to make sense of what their life means to them, and what they want out of it, and why they might not be able to get there at the moment. I don't think people stop having that kind of ability and that capability to make sense of their own existence. And
so the very act of doing that then is the start, at least, I guess, of enabling people to transform themselves.
Yeah. And having someone come and work alongside them and be with them is important to me. Rather than as soon as we take the role of expert and who are looking down, objectifying, pinning them to a set of meanings, we lose that capacity to actually engage with them, really.
Now I want to talk to you about the... it's a good point to talk to you about the sort of your other sort of career. Your career as an academic researcher and lecturer. So you're currently working at the University of Sheffield. Yeah. And you're interested in this sort of using phenomenology, which is a sort of a discourse that I'm generally familiar with, and you see something of value in this. And I think that stems out of what you've just been saying, because the phenomenologist in some way what they're doing is rejecting sort of mechanistic understandings, mechanistic and deterministic understandings of what a human being is.
Yeah.
And by that I mean it's, we don't see the human being as a machine, right? And you see phenomenology as useful to the social worker. You think it's a tool or a method that they can use, that the individual social worker can use to understand their profession?
I do. I do. And I think there's that kind of like, I wouldn't like to think of it as a tool, but as a perspective. Yeah, as a way of sort of thinking about it.
Yeah, well, a tool is a very instrumental way of thinking.
It is. But actually just being able to sort of say, right, okay, what this person is not a set of givens. It's not a set of, everything that's happened to them in their past lives makes up who they are now. And if I know that, I can predict how they're going to behave in the future. Is actually sort of, this is a person who is not mechanistic, is not deterministic. They've got a whole set of possibilities ahead of them.
So that's an interesting word, possibility, isn't it? Because if you're on sort of the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're just like, if you're going, okay, I need to get food, I need to get water, I need to get shelter, I need to get clothes for my kids, and that occupies like my attention from morning till night. Where then can I get my meaning from? How can I sort of build on that?
Well, yeah, who knows? And help as a social worker, helping them access the resources in society.
What possibilities is what I mean. Yeah.
Is that kind of first stage? And because if you very often a lot of the basic social work is like making sure they're getting the right benefits. Making sure that housing is
bread and butter
safe.
Stuff.
It's bread and butter stuff. But all those things are really important. And if we can help people to resolve some of those really fundamental basics in life, you're stopping them, being constantly engaged in trying to manage that. And then the next bit is about, right, well, okay, so here we are. We've got the basics in place. What's possible now? Where do you want to be? Well, where do you want to go? What are your aspirations? And that's phenomenology.
Yeah, certain
for me.
Yeah, I mean, Heidegger sort of says that the one thing that sort of defines the human is, well, that we're beings in a world, in a context, and in a practice, but we're also beings that are potential. Yeah, which is, potential is neither here nor there, literally. It's not.
And Heidegger's idea about being towards death, where we're conscious of being conscious, but we all know that we're going to die, so we can sort of like work towards that. Means that we've got a responsibility to kind of like make the most of that.
That's exactly his point. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, you make yourself authentic, or make yourself real, or find meaning. But is that something? Is the question of death something that a social worker could raise in a meeting with clients in a particularly sort of a delicate situation?
We deal with ideas about death constantly. Especially when we're working with adults or might work with people with life-limiting illnesses, or older people sort of moving towards the end of their lives. Even with children with difficult situations and child protection, death sort of preoccupies us as a profession.
And I mean, I guess, is this why you're sort of going to these phenomenologists or existential philosophers? You think that they give you a register or a way of talking about things such as that, like death or like anxiety?
Yeah, anxiety especially. That's really interesting. And as a profession, we're in this constant, what Heidegger calls Stimmung of mood,
atmosphere,
of anxiety that we can't. It's not very direction. It's not directed towards anything. It's just this constant state of being anxious.
He does draw that distinction famously in Being in Time. He says, on the one hand, you fear something specific. You fear, I don't know, you're afraid of heights, or you're afraid of a bull in a field. So given my agricultural background there, you're afraid of a dog barking at you when you come home at night, whatever, but anxiety is just sort of ever pervasive.
And I think we mix those two up in social work. So I think very often we can have very real fear for a service user's positions, where might actually have fear that a aggressive parent is going to hurt a child. That's a very real fear. That's got a direction. We can think. I'm scared that might happen to that person.
And that's something you have to take on board. And
And that's something real to work on. But what we then end up with is this real global state of anxiety that's just generally about us feeling scared about how we're engaging with the world and how we're engaging with our service users. I think Heidegger's got a lot to offer there.
Yeah.
I also quite like some of Arendt's.
Yes, you've written on Arendt as well. Could you maybe speak to that?
Well, I think one of the Arendt's book, The Human Condition, was like really sort of turned me into a phenomenologist. I think her idea is that every human interaction is a sort of evanescent chain. You know, I say something to you, it's said, it's there, it's out there, and you'll do something with that.
It's an encounter,
yeah, and I'll respond to it, and it sort of moves on, and all those things sort of bubble away, and like they sort of fizz off, and they've gone, but they can't be unsaid. None of those things can be undone, or things they exist in that sort of timeline. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about how we engage with each other and how we engage with our service users. But what Arendt then goes on to talk about is about natality. So rather than Heidegger's preoccupation with death, she talks about new birth and things being newborn. And I think if we can always sort of see people as potentially something else, there's a new chapter in their lives, there's a new potential, a new possibility. That's a real positive way of thinking about things. It's not about, you know, the only fixed route that they're going to go down. It's actually about thinking about all their possibilities and where we might end up.
I wonder, I mean, if I think of, say if one of your clients hypothetically is like sort of got a very, very, very profound substance addiction, you know, there's sort of no political outlet, which I think is probably the case in in large parts of Britain at the moment. What do you do then with them? Is it if they said to you, like, it's all right, Joe, talking about natality and possibility and potentiality, I'm a junkie. Yeah. You know, and it's how do I get out of this, or how does Arendt help me?
I would work with that person to stop them seeing themselves as being fixed, and actually, you know, that so at the moment you're using lots of Class A substances or whatever. Do you need to do that tomorrow? You know, you have a choice. You have a choice when you wake up tomorrow. Now, some of those things are going to put constraints on those choices, and we need to recognise those because it's all, you know, they're contexts to what people.
About recognising specific limitations.
Recognising specific limitations, but within those kind of things, recognising that they still have choices, and they can be difficult choices to make, but they're still there. If we sort of just kind of think, oh well, you know, this is someone who's hopeless because they're a junkie, and that's it. That's them as fixed. If we start seeing them as fixed, it's not surprising that they're going to see themselves as fixed still. And actually, sort of like recognizing when they've not been that, when they've been other things, when they've been other people and had other lives, and because not everyone's always been who they are now.
I guess it comes back to me, I think, to poverty. I mean, that's the big sort of thing that people need to talk about in that. And if you are poor, you know, you don't have possibility. Yeah.
And that's ultimately the big thing. The social work has always got to keep sort of challenged on that macro level that, you know, government policies of austerity have severely limited the life chances of a whole generation of people. And that's the reality of it. And the government's got some choices to make about how it does that. But what we can help people is like, well, within the bounds of that, within the context of that, you know, what choices have you still got?
I wonder, is the answer just to give people free money?
I think free money is a really good idea. I think...
Who'd say no?
I think, is it Finland have been experimenting with that?
Oh, right. So you mean like sort of basic income sort of proposals? Yeah, because it would certainly give people, I guess, a start to go, okay, how can I sort of be creative? How can I be imaginative? How can I get possibility back in my life? Yeah. I
think Finland have actually been trying that for a couple of years now, giving everyone free money.
Marvellous. Marvellous. Yeah. Okay, so is there, in terms of, sort of slightly digress there, but just in terms of how you think of the social worker within the sort of the place where we are now, I mean, are there things, Joe, that you would, kind of coming out of phenomenology and your research on that and looking at Arendt and looking at Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and these sort of great philosophers, are there recommendations, do you think, you would say give to your average social worker? I mean, what do you say to your to your undergraduates when you're teaching them? Or I know you work with sort of social workers as well who are doing sort of continuing professional development.
Yeah.
What do you say to them? And I mean, how do they respond? I'm curious.
Well, I think it's because what I don't want to do is strip everyone away from everything they've got. So it's like, there are a given set of tools that people have for them, and I think it's if they just have that possibility of sort of saying, this isn't the answer, this is going to lead you towards an understanding, but you still have a responsibility to bring your meaning to that, but also you have a responsibility to the service users to help them accept their agency and make decisions for themselves and listen to them. One of the things we don't do very well, I think we pretend that we do, but I don't think we do, is we don't listen to service users and give them the respect to say, this is what my life means to me. It's fine you coming along, social worker, and as an expert, and throwing lots of theory at me from a psychological or sociological perspective, but you're not living my life, and actually I'm here in it, and this is what it means to me, and this is what I want out of it. We come in with and externally impose something, an understanding, a set of meanings to that. And sometimes, we kind of need to do that in order to keep everyone in the situation safe. But as much as possible, we should be sort of like allowing people to express their own sense of who they are within that. Tools are important. They're a way of structuring work. They're a way of starting to engage with things and having something to hang stuff on. But at the end of the day, the responsibility of like making the decisions got to be the social workers. They have to take that responsibility and make sense of it for themselves.
And do you still believe in social work after all this time?
I do, absolutely. Yeah. It's it engages with the most marginalised members of society, and very often the ones who are the most vulnerable. And for the most part, it helps them live more happy, fulfilled lives. Absolutely it does. Unfortunately, we're only ever judged by those kind of outlier things where something goes horribly wrong. Social workers don't kill children. It's usually, their parents or carers who do that. So we've got to shift that discourse that, social workers are to blame when things go wrong. It's like, sometimes they have some responsibility, but at the end of the day, they can't be there 24 hours a day. And for the most part, we get it right.
Yeah, I guess it's about sort of coping with blame.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to go, I guess. How does one cope with blame?
Yeah.
Accusation, which comes your way a lot, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it does. Well, what we can't do is what we've been doing recently, and retreating into that defensive position of only engaging with people in order to defend ourselves. I think we have to sort of go out there into the world and sort of say, look, we are making the best decisions we can possibly make. We're trying to give people the best resources we can. Sometimes that's going to go wrong. If something only happens 0.1% of the time, in 0.1% of cases, it's going to happen. So we could be 99.9% right, but occasionally those things are going to happen. We can't structure everything else to try to avoid those very, very rare, very sad, very tragic.
It's difficult because you're expected to be invincible, aren't you?
Yeah.
And no one is.
No one is. Absolutely no one is. And it's like if surgeons had to face the same level of blame for people who die on the operating table as social workers do, we end up with absolutely no one ever going through surgery.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good place to end it, Joe. We've been talking for an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, is that okay? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No.
Very good. All right, thanks for being with us. Okay.
Cheers.